A Stolen Childhood in the Shadow of Topkapı. The mist hung low over Koprivstica, a small Bulgarian village nestled in the folds of the Balkan hills, as the first light of dawn crept across the thatched roofs. It was spring 1550, and the air carried the scent of damp earth and fresh bread baking in hearths. In a modest hut at the village's edge, 12-year-old Stefan hummed a lullaby his mother had sung since he was a babe, his small hands tracing the curves of a wooden toy horse his father had carved. His green eyes bright with dreams of becoming a blacksmith like his father, Ivan, sparkled as he watched the embers glow in the forge. Life was simple here. His mother Anna's warm embrace, his little sister Maria's giggles as they chased each other through the fields, and the quiet pride of a family bound by love and faith. To Stefan, this village was the world, and he could imagine no other. But that morning the world he knew shattered. The ground trembled with the thunder of hooves, and a shadow fell over the village. Anna froze at the hearth, her hands clutching a wooden cross necklace so tightly her knuckles whitened. "They're here," she whispered, her voice trembling like a leaf in a storm. Ivan dropped his hammer, its clang swallowed by the rising screams outside. The Ottoman officials had come, as they did every few years, to collect the devshirme, the blood tax that tore Christian boys from their families to serve the Sultan's empire. Stefan peered through the hut's narrow window, his heart pounding like a drum. Men in ornate robes strode through the village square, their faces cold as stone, flanked by janissary guards whose scimitars glinted in the pale light. Women wailed, their cries piercing the air as boys, some barely 8, others nearly men, were dragged from their homes. Stefan saw his friend Dimitar, a lanky 13-year-old, yanked from his mother's arms. She clawed at the dirt, screaming his name, but a janissary's boot shoved her back, silencing her pleas. The village was a tapestry of despair, woven from the sobs of mothers and the helpless silence of fathers too broken to fight. "Stefan, hide!" Anna hissed, shoving him toward the back of the hut where a loose floorboard concealed a shallow crawl space. But before he could move, the door burst open. A tall official stepped inside, his neatly trimmed beard framing a face that held no warmth. His eyes, sharp as a hawk's, scanned the room and landed on Stefan. A faint smile curled his lips, chilling the air. "This one," he said, his voice smooth and final, like a blade sliding into its sheath. Behind him a scribe scribbled in a leather-bound ledger, ready to record the day's harvest. "Fair of face, strong of build. He'll do for the palace." "No!" Anna lunged forward, falling to her knees before the official. "Please, he's my only son. Take our grain, our tools, anything but him." Tears streamed down her face as she clutched the hem of his robe, but he stepped back, his expression one of disgust. A janissary seized her arms, pulling her away as she screamed Stefan's name. Ivan stood frozen, his fists clenched, knowing that resistance would bring death to them all. Maria, only 6, sobbed in the corner, her tiny hands covering her face as if she could hide from the nightmare unfolding. Stefan's world tilted as rough hands grabbed his arms, dragging him outside. He kicked and twisted, his small frame no match for the guard's iron grip. "Mama!" he cried, his voice breaking like a twig. Anna reached for him, her fingers brushing his for a fleeting moment before she was shoved back, collapsing in the dirt. Her cross necklace fell from her hand, glinting in the dust as Stefan was pulled into the square. He caught one last glimpse of her face, etched with anguish, before the crowd swallowed her. In the square, chaos reigned. Boys stood in a ragged line, some trembling, others staring blankly, as if already severing themselves from the life they knew. The official moved down the line, inspecting each boy with the detachment of a merchant appraising livestock. He paused before Stefan, tilting the boy's chin to study his green eyes and unblemished skin. "This one has the nature of a gazelle," he murmured to the scribe, who wrote, "Stefan, son of Ivan, from Koprivshtitsa, age 12 years, fair of face, renamed Süleiman, assigned to the Enduran school." The name Süleiman struck Stefan like a lash. It was a blade that cut him from his past, from his mother's lullabies, from the prayers he whispered in the dark. As the boys were chained together, Stefan's eyes darted to a gnarled oak at the square's edge. With a trembling hand, he scratched his true name into the bark with a jagged stone, a desperate act to hold on to the boy he was. The toy horse, still clutched in his fist, was torn away by a guard and tossed into the dirt, its carved eyes staring blankly at the sky. The march to Istanbul began as dusk painted the hills in shades of blood and shadow. The boys, bound by chains that bit into their wrists, trudged through forests and over rocky paths, their bare feet bleeding. Hunger gnawed at Stefan's stomach, and exhaustion blurred his vision, but he dared not falter. Whispers among the boys told of those who fell left unburied by the roadside as a warning to others. Stefan learned to steal crusts of bread from weaker boys, to ignore the cries of those too sick to continue. Each step toward the capital was a step away from the boy who dreamed of forging iron, a transformation forced by the empire's unyielding will. Weeks later, the spires of Topkapı Palace rose against the horizon, their golden domes gleaming like a promise of glory. To the world, this was the heart of the Ottoman Empire, a monument to power and splendor. But to Stefan, it was a gilded cage, its walls hiding a machinery of cruelty that would reshape him or break him. As he passed through the palace gates, the clank of chains gave way to an eerie silence, broken only by the footsteps of boys like him, sorted like gems in the courtyards. The most beautiful, like Stefan, were marked for the Enduran school, a place where education was a weapon, and survival meant surrendering everything he held dear. Topkapı loomed not as a palace, but as a labyrinth of nightmares, where boys learned to forget their mothers' voices and replace them with prayers that felt like stones in their mouths. Stefan's green eyes, once bright with dreams, now reflected fear and defiance. The empire that crafted exquisite poetry and ruled 3 continents was built on the bones of children like him, their innocence ground to dust to fuel its glory. This was the Devshirmanot tax, but a curse, a machine that turned boys into instruments of power, their identities erased, their bodies broken, their souls bound to an empire that thrived on their pain. Into the heart of Topkapı. The gates of Topkapı Palace closed behind Stefan with a hollow clang, sealing him into a world as alien as it was terrifying. The boy from Koprivshtitsa, now called Süleiman by the Ottoman scribe's decree, stood in the first courtyard, his wrists still raw from the chains that had bound him during the long march from his village. The air was thick with the scent of jasmine and polished marble, but beneath the splendor lay a chill that seeped into his bones. The golden domes of the palace, gleaming under the Istanbul sun, seemed to mock the tattered remnants of his dreams. Dreams of hammering iron beside his father, of chasing his sister Maria through the fields, of his mother Anna's lullabies. Those dreams felt like ghosts now, fading with each step he took into the heart of the Ottoman Empire. The courtyard bustled with activity, but it was a strange, ordered chaos. Boys like Stefan, some trembling, others staring blankly, were herded by stern-faced eunuchs in flowing robes. These men, their faces smooth and their voices high, moved with a quiet authority that made Stefan's stomach twist. He noticed their eyes cold, yet haunted, as if they too had once stood in this courtyard, stripped of their past. A boy beside him, a wiry lad with dark curls and a faint scar on his cheek, whispered in a language Stefan recognized as Serbian. "They're sorting us," the boy said, his voice barely audible. "The pretty ones go to the palace. The rest, who knows?" Stefan's heart sank. His green eyes and unblemished skin, once a source of his mother's pride, now felt like a curse. The sorting began under the shadow of a towering cypress tree. A chief eunuch, his robe embroidered with silver threads, paced before the line of boys, his gaze sharp as a blade. He stopped before Stefan, lifting the boy's chin with a gloved hand. "This one," he said to a scribe who scribbled in a ledger, "to the ender in school. He has the grace of a gazelle." The words spoken in Ottoman Turkish were incomprehensible to Stefan, but the tone sent a shiver down his spine. He glanced at the Serbian boy who was directed to a different group, his fate unclear. Stefan wanted to call out, to cling to the last familiar face, but the eunuch's hand tightened on his shoulder, steering him toward a stone archway. The Enderun school, hidden within the palace's third courtyard, was unlike anything Stefan had imagined. The halls were lined with intricate tiles, their patterns swirling in blues and golds, and the air carried the faint hum of recited prayers. But beneath the beauty lay a suffocating order. Stefan and a dozen other boys, all new arrivals, were led to a chamber where their clothes tattered remnants of their villages were stripped away and burned in a brazier. The acrid smoke stung Stefan's eyes as he stood shivering, clad only in a thin linen shift. Eunuchs bathed them in the palace hammam, their hands scrubbing every inch of skin with a clinical precision that made Stefan feel like livestock. One boy, no older than 10, wept silently as his hair was shaved, his curls falling to the floor like autumn leaves. Stefan clenched his fists, forcing himself to stay still, to not cry out. Forgetting was survival, and survival was the only virtue here. The first night in the dormitory was a lesson in silence. 40 boys lay on narrow beds lining a long, vaulted chamber, their breaths synchronized as if fear had taught them to breathe as one. Stefan clutched his thin blanket, trying to summon the memory of his sister's face, but it blurred, slipping away like water through his fingers. The boy in the next bed, a pale lad with hollow eyes, wept softly, his sobs muffled by his pillow. Stefan wanted to reach out, to offer a word of comfort, but the weight of unseen eyes stopped him. Senior pages, older boys who had survived years in the palace, patrolled the dormitory, their lanterns casting long shadows. "Hassan!" they called the weeping boy, though Stefan doubted it was his true name. By morning, Hassan's bed was empty, his blanket neatly folded. No one asked where he went. The silence was a rule, unspoken but absolute, and Stefan learned it quickly. Days in the Enderun school were a relentless cycle of lessons and inspections, each designed to erase the boys' pasts and mold them into instruments of the Sultan's will. Mornings began before dawn with prayers in a cavernous mosque, where Stefan stumbled over Arabic words that felt heavy and foreign in his mouth. The religious instructors, stern men with piercing gazes, watched for any sign of defiance, a whispered Christian prayer, a fleeting sign of the cross. One boy, caught fasting during Lent, was dragged away, his screams echoing through the marble halls. Stefan learned to bow his head, to mimic the prayers, but in the quiet of his mind, he clung to fragments of his mother's hymns, whispering them like a secret rebellion. The academic lessons were as rigorous as they were cruel. Stefan studied mathematics, its logic a strange comfort amidst the chaos, and Persian poetry, whose beauty felt like a trap. The instructors praised his quick mind, but every compliment came with a warning. serve well or perish. Afternoons brought calligraphy and music, skills meant to make the boys versatile, pleasing to the Sultan in ways Stefan didn't yet understand. But it was the inspections that haunted him most. Eunuchs roamed the halls, checking for signs of puberty hair, voice changes that might diminish a boy's value. Stefan saw older boys, their faces pale with fear, summoned to the infirmary where screams pierced the night. He didn't know what happened there, but the word castration, whispered among the boys, sent a chill through him. Survival, he realized, might come at a cost he couldn't yet fathom. The palace itself was a labyrinth of control. Its nested courtyards, each more opulent than the last, were a geography of power and vulnerability. The closer one got to the Sultan's chambers, the greater the honor and the danger. Stefan's dormitory, in the third courtyard, was a place of perpetual surveillance. No doors could be locked, no conversations held without the risk of eavesdropping. The chief page, a boy of 16 with eyes like a hawk, kept a log of every infraction, bedwetting a whispered word, a moment of hesitation. Stefan learned to sleep in approved postures, to suppress nightmares that might betray weakness. The footsteps of night inspections, soft but deliberate, became the rhythm of his fear. One night, a week into his new life, Stefan was summoned for special preparation. A eunuch led him to the hammam, where attendants bathed him in rose-scented water and dressed him in silk so thin it felt like air. They taught him to walk with small steps, eyes downcast, movements fluid like water. "You are learning to be civilized," the eunuch said, but Stefan's heart pounded with a truth he couldn't name. He was led to a chamber where a vizier, an older man with a silver beard, waited. The man's smile was gentle, but his eyes were hungry. Stefan's body moved as he'd been taught, but his mind floated above, watching himself as if from a distance. When it was over, he returned to the dormitory, his skin burning with shame he couldn't voice. The other boys avoided his gaze, their silence a shared wound. Yet amidst the horror, Stefan found flickers of resistance. In the dormitory's shadows, he overheard two boys whispering orthodox prayers, their voices a fragile thread to a world beyond the palace. One night, he found a scrap of fabric under his mattress, embroidered with a Cyrillic letter, a relic from another boy perhaps, who had clung to his past. Stefan hid it in his sleeve, a talisman against the erasure of his identity. He began to teach himself to remember, reciting his true name, Stefan, son of Ivan, in his mind each night, tracing the oak tree where he'd carved it in his village. These small acts were dangerous, but they kept a spark of the boy he'd been alive. The palace, however, was relentless in its efforts to extinguish that spark. Older pages, survivors of the same horrors, were tasked with enforcing the system. One, a boy named Mehmet, who had once been Marco from a Greek village, watched Stefan with a mix of pity and calculation. "Obey and you might live," Mehmet told him one evening, his voice low. "Resist and you'll vanish like Hassan." Stefan saw the truth in Mehmet's eyes. A boy who had survived by becoming part of the machine, his own pain buried under layers of compliance. The palace rewarded such transformation, offering privileges to those who facilitated the suffering of others. Stefan wondered if he too would one day stand in Mehmet's place, choosing survival over humanity. Weeks turned to months, and Stefan's body adapted to the palace's rhythm, but his soul remained a battleground. He excelled in his lessons, earning the grudging approval of his instructors, but each night brought nightmares of his mother's face, fading like a painting left in the rain. He heard stories of boys who rose through the ranks, becoming viziers or generals, their pasts erased but their power immense. Yet he also heard of those who disappeared, sent to dangerous military posts, or strangled with a silk cord, their deaths marked as natural in the palace records. The line between survival and annihilation was thin, and Stefan walked it with every breath. One evening, as he practiced calligraphy under a flickering lantern, Stefan overheard a senior page speak of the Sultan himself, a distant figure who watched from behind latticed screens during inspections. The thought chilled him. The Sultan, the empire's godlike ruler, was the architect of this gilded hell. Yet Stefan also heard whispers of boys who had escaped, fleeing to distant lands like Austria or Muscovy. The stories were rare, almost mythical, but they planted a seed in Stefan's heart. Could he too find a way out? Or would Topkapı's golden walls claim him, as they had so many others, turning him into a tool of the empire that had stolen his childhood? The Devshirme was no mere tax, it was a curse, a machine that ground boys into dust to build an empire's glory. Stefan, now Süleiman, stood at its edge, a boy of 12 whose green eyes still held a flicker of defiance. The palace taught him to forget, but he chose to remember, clinging to the memory of a village oak, a mother's lullaby, and a name that was his own. In the heart of Topkapı, where beauty masked brutality, Stefan's fight to remain himself had only just begun. The breaking and remaking of Süleiman. The marble halls of Topkapı Palace gleamed under the flicker of oil lamps, their intricate tiles casting shadows that danced like specters across Stefan's path. Months had passed since the boy from Koprivshtitsa, now called Süleiman, had been torn from his village and thrust into the Enderun school's relentless crucible. His green eyes, once bright with dreams of forging iron beside his father, now carried a guarded wariness, honed by the palace's unyielding lessons in survival. The 12-year-old had learned to move silently, to bow his head during prayers, and to suppress the tremors that came with the memory of his mother, Anna's tear-streaked face. Yet beneath the surface, the spark of Stefan, the boy who had scratched his true name into an oak tree, still flickered, fragile but unbroken. Life in the Enderun school was a paradox of splendor and terror. The days were filled with rigorous study, each lesson a thread in the tapestry of control that wove the boys into the empire's fabric. Stefan excelled in mathematics, finding solace in its unyielding logic, a stark contrast to the capricious cruelty of the palace. He memorized Persian poetry, its verses of longing and loss echoing the ache in his heart, though he dared not speak of it. His calligraphy, once clumsy, now flowed with precision, earning nods from instructors who saw in him the potential for greatness or servitude. But every achievement came at a cost. The instructor's praise was laced with threats, and the eunuch's watchful eyes never strayed far. "You are the Sultan's," they reminded him, their voices cold as the marble beneath his feet. "Your mind, your body, your soul, all belong to him." The dormitory, a long chamber lined with narrow beds, was a place of suffocating surveillance. Stefan lay awake at night, his breath shallow to avoid notice, listening to the soft footsteps of senior pages who patrolled with lanterns. The memory of Hassan, the boy who had wept and vanished, haunted him. No one spoke of the empty beds, but their silence screamed louder than any cry. Stefan clutched the scrap of Cyrillic embroidered fabric he had found under his mattress, a relic of another boy's defiance. He hid it inside his sleeve, a secret anchor to the world beyond Topkapı. In the quiet of his mind, he whispered his true name, Stefan, son of Ivan, each night, a ritual to keep the palace from swallowing him whole. The inspections were the worst. Eunuchs roamed the halls, their gloved hands probing for signs of puberty that might diminish a boy's value. Stefan, still young, escaped the worst of their scrutiny, but he saw older boys summoned to the infirmary, their faces pale with dread. Whispers of castration drifted through the dormitory like poison, tales of screams echoing from the palace's hidden chambers. One boy, a 14-year-old named Yusuf, returned from such a summons, his eyes hollow and his gait unsteady. He spoke little afterward, his once lively spirit reduced to a shadow. Stefan overheard a senior page murmur that the surgery, performed without anesthesia, killed 1 in 10. The screams, he said, were a warning to all. Stefan's stomach churned, but he learned to bury his fear, to wear the mask of compliance the palace demanded. The palace's hierarchy was a pyramid of exploitation, each level preying on the one below. The senior pages, like Mehmet, who had once been Marco, enforced the rules with a mix of pity and ruthlessness. Mehmet, now 17, had survived years in the Enderun, his Greek accent long erased by Ottoman Turkish. He watched Stefan with a strange intensity, as if seeing his younger self in the boy's green eyes. "You're clever," Mehmet told him one evening, as they practiced calligraphy under a flickering lantern. "That's dangerous here. Clever boys are noticed, and notice brings expectations." His voice trailed off, and Stefan saw a flicker of pain in his eyes, quickly masked. Mehmet had survived by becoming part of the system, facilitating the horrors he had once endured. Stefan wondered if he, too, would one day stand in Mehmet's place, trading his soul for survival. The special preparations were the darkest shadow over Stefan's days. Several times a month, he was summoned to the hammam, where attendants bathed him in rose-scented water and dressed him in silk so thin it clung to his skin like a second shadow. They taught him to move with grace, to keep his eyes downcast, to smile in a way that pleased. "You are the Sultan's gazelle," a eunuch once said, his voice soft but menacing. Stefan didn't fully understand what it meant, but the weight of it pressed on his chest. The chambers where he was taken were opulent, with velvet cushions and gilded mirrors, but they were prisons all the same. The viziers, men with silver beards and hungry eyes, spoke kindly, offering sweets or trinkets, but their touches were not kind, and Stefan learned to float above his body, watching himself from a distance as he performed the acts they demanded. When he returned to the dormitory, the other boys averted their eyes, their silence a shared shame. Yet even in this gilded hell, Stefan found moments of resistance. One night in the dormitory's shadows, he overheard 2 boys whispering a fragment of an Orthodox prayer, their voices trembling but defiant. They called each other by secret names: Petar, Nikolai, names the palace had tried to erase. Inspired, Stefan began to whisper his own prayers, the ones his mother had taught him under his breath during the pre-dawn sala. He carved a tiny cross into the underside of his bed frame, so small it was invisible unless you knew where to look. These acts were dangerous, but they were his rebellion, a way to hold on to the boy he had been. He thought of the oak tree in his village, where he had scratched his name and imagined it still standing, a silent witness to his existence. The palace, however, was a master at breaking such spirits. The curriculum was not just education, but indoctrination, designed to sever the boys from their past. Stefan studied the Quran, not for enlightenment, but to justify his enslavement within the empire's laws. He learned Ottoman Turkish, Arabic, and Persian, his tongue twisting around words that felt like chains. The instructors spoke of the Sultan as a divine figure, his will absolute, his palace a paradise. But Stefan saw the truth in the dormitory's shadows, in the empty beds, in the screams that echoed from the infirmary. The palace was no paradise. It was a machine that ground boys into tools, their identities erased to serve an empire that thrived on their pain. One day during a lesson on Ottoman law, Stefan's hand slipped, smudging the ink on his calligraphy. The instructor, a gaunt man with a whip-thin voice, struck him across the knuckles with a wooden rod. Precision is loyalty, he snapped. The Sultan sees all. Stefan bit his lip to keep from crying out. But the pain was nothing compared to the humiliation. Later, in the dormitory, Mehmet bandaged his hand, his touch surprisingly gentle. "You'll learn," he said, his voice low, "or you'll break." Stefan wanted to ask Mehmet how he had survived, what he had sacrificed. But the older boy's eyes held a warning. Some questions were too dangerous to ask. The palace's punishments were as calculated as its lessons. The bastinado, a beating on the soles of the feet, was common, leaving boys hobbling but their faces unmarked, preserving their value. Stefan saw a boy, caught whispering in his native tongue, endure the punishment, his screams muffled by a cloth. More severe infractions led to the dungeons, where sensory deprivation and starvation broke even the strongest spirits. The ultimate sanction was the silk cord, a strangulation so expertly done it left no marks. Stefan overheard a senior page speak of a boy who had refused a vizier's summons, only to vanish the next day. Natural causes, the palace record said, but the boys knew better. The cord was a reminder, defiance was death. Yet there were whispers of hope, fragile as candlelight. One night, Stefan overheard a senior page speak of an escaped boy who had fled during a diplomatic mission to Austria, disappearing into the forests of the Habsburg Empire. The story was a myth, a flicker of possibility in a world of iron rules. Stefan clung to it, imagining himself running through the Balkan hills, finding his way back to Koprivshtitsa. But the palace was a labyrinth, its walls high and its guards ever watchful. Escape seemed impossible, yet the thought kept Stefan's heart beating. Months turned to years and Stefan grew taller, his voice beginning to deepen. The eunuchs noticed, their inspections growing more frequent. One day he was summoned to the infirmary, his heart pounding as he walked past the chamber where screams were born. The chief eunuch, a man with a face like carved ivory, examined him, his hands cold and clinical. "Not yet," he said, dismissing Stefan with a wave. But the threat of castration loomed, a shadow over his every step. He saw boys return from the procedure, their spirits broken, their bodies forever altered. Yusuf, the hollow-eyed boy, whispered to Stefan one night, "They take more than flesh. They take your soul." Stefan's resistance grew subtler, more desperate. He began to memorize the palace's layout, noting the patterns of the guards, the hidden passages behind tapestries. He befriended a boy named Nikolai, who had been taken from a Serbian village. Together they shared fragments of their past in whispered conversations, teaching each other prayers and songs. Nikolai showed Stefan a tiny wooden cross he had carved, hidden in a crack in the dormitory wall. "They can't take everything," Nikolai said, his eyes fierce. Stefan nodded, his fingers brushing the Cyrillic embroidered fabric in his sleeve. These small acts were their rebellion, a fragile thread connecting them to the boys they had been. But the palace was relentless, and Stefan felt its weight pressing harder each day. Mehmet, now a trusted page, was tasked with selecting boys for special service. Stefan saw the pain in his eyes as he chose a younger boy, his hands trembling as he handed him over to a vizier. "I have no choice," Mehmet whispered later, his voice breaking. Stefan wanted to hate him, but he saw the truth. Mehmet was as much a prisoner as he was, trapped in a cycle where victims became perpetrators to survive. As Stefan's 13th birthday passed, marked only by a stolen moment of prayer, he felt the boy he had been slipping away. The palace's lessons of obedience, of silence, of surrender, were carving him into Süleiman, a tool of the empire. Yet in the quiet of his heart, he held on to Stefan, son of Ivan, the boy who had dreamed of forging iron. The oak tree in his village, the lullaby his mother sang, The cross he had carved, these were his anchors, fragile but unbroken. In Topkapı's gilded halls, where beauty masked brutality, Stefan's fight to remain himself was a silent war, one he vowed to wage as long as he drew breath. The price of survival. The air in Topkapı Palace hung heavy with the scent of incense and fear, a constant reminder of the gilded cage that held Stefan, now called Süleiman, captive. At 13, he was no longer the wide-eyed boy torn from Koprivshtitsa, but neither was he fully the palace's creation. His green eyes, though shadowed by months of vigilance, still held a flicker of defiance, a spark of the boy who had scratched his true name into an oak tree. The Enderun school had sharpened his mind. Mathematics, Persian poetry, and Ottoman law flowed through him like the ink he wielded in calligraphy, but it had also honed his instincts for survival. Each day in the palace was a tightrope walk, balancing obedience with the quiet rebellion that kept Stefan, son of Ivan, alive in his heart. The dormitory, with its rows of narrow beds and ever-watchful senior pages, was a crucible of silence and surveillance. Stefan lay awake at night, his fingers tracing the tiny cross he had carved into the underside of his bed frame, a secret so small it felt like a shout against the palace's suffocating control. The scrap of Cyrillic embroidered fabric hidden in his sleeve was his talisman, a tether to the village where his mother Anna's lullabies still echoed in his memory. But the palace was relentless, its machinery of cruelty designed to grind down such anchors. The screams from the infirmary, where boys faced castration, haunted his dreams. In the empty beds, Hassan's, Yusuf's, and others were a constant reminder of the cost of resistance. Stefan's friendship with Nikolai, a Serbian boy with a sharp wit and fiercer spirit, was a lifeline in this gilded hell. In stolen moments, they whispered fragments of their pasts, Orthodox prayers, village songs, the names of siblings they might never see again. Nikolai's tiny wooden cross, hidden in a crack in the dormitory wall, was a mirror to Stefan's own rebellion. "They can't take everything," Nikolai had said, his eyes blazing with a courage that both inspired and frightened Stefan. But their bond was dangerous. The senior pages, like Mehmet, watched for suspicious friendships, and the chief eunuch's logbooks recorded every whisper, every glance. Stefan learned to speak in glances, to hide his thoughts behind a mask of compliance. The palace's hierarchy was a pyramid of complicity, and Stefan saw its toll on those above him. Mehmet, once Marco from a Greek village, was now a trusted page, his role to enforce the system that had broken him. Stefan saw the conflict in Mehmet's eyes when he selected boys for special service, his hands trembling as he led them to the hammam. One night, after a younger boy was summoned by a vizier, Mehmet lingered in the dormitory, his face pale. "I was you once," he whispered to Stefan, his voice raw. "I fought, I wept, I lost. Survival is all that's left." Stefan wanted to ask what Mehmet had sacrificed, but the older boy's haunted gaze silenced him. The palace turned victims into perpetrators, and Stefan feared the day he might face the same choice. The special preparations were a recurring nightmare. Several times a month, Stefan was called to the hammam, where attendants bathed him in rose-scented water and dressed him in silk so thin it felt like a second skin. They taught him to move with grace, to keep his eyes downcast, to smile in a way that pleased. The chambers where he was taken were opulent, with velvet cushions and gilded mirrors. But they were prisons of another kind. The viziers, with their silver beards and honeyed words, offered sweets or trinkets, but their touches were a violation Stefan couldn't name. He learned to float above his body, watching himself from a distance, a trick that dulled the pain but left a hollow ache in his chest. When he returned to the dormitory, The other boy's averted gazes were a mirror of his own shame, a silent pact of endurance. Yet Stefan's resistance grew, subtle but stubborn. He memorized the palace's layout, hidden passages behind tapestries, the rhythm of the guards' patrols, the creak of a gate left unlatched. He and Nikolai devised a code, tapping rhythms on the dormitory floor to signal when it was safe to whisper. They shared stories of escape, myths of boys who had fled to Austria or Muscovy, though such tales were as rare as stars in a storm. One night Nikolai whispered of a boy who had hidden in a diplomat's caravan, slipping away under cover of darkness. "We could do it," Nikolai said, his voice fierce. "We could be free." Stefan's heart raced, but fear anchored him. The palace's walls were high, its punishment swift. Still, the seed of escape took root, a fragile hope in a world of iron rules. The Enderun's curriculum was a double-edged sword, sharpening Stefan's mind while cutting away his past. He studied Ottoman law, its clauses justifying his enslavement, and theology that framed the Sultan as a divine figure. The instructor spoke of the empire's glory, but Stefan saw the truth in the dormitory shadows, in the boys who vanished, in the screams that pierced the night. His calligraphy lessons, once a source of pride, became a battleground. One day he hid a fragment of a Christian prayer in the flourishes of his script, a rebellion so subtle no one noticed. But the act strengthened him, a reminder that the palace hadn't claimed his soul. Punishments were a constant threat, their cruelty disguised as discipline. The bastinado beatings on the soles of the feet left boys hobbling, but their faces unmarked, preserving their value. Stefan endured it once, for hesitating during a lesson, the pain searing through him as he bit his lip to keep from crying out. More severe infractions led to the dungeons, where darkness and starvation broke even the strongest spirits. The silk cord, a strangulation so precise it left no marks, was the ultimate sanction. Stefan overheard a senior page speak of a boy who had refused a vizier's summons, only to disappear. Natural causes, the record said, but the boys knew the truth. The cord was a specter, a reminder that defiance was a gamble with death. One evening, as Stefan practiced music in a candlelit chamber, a new horror unfolded. A boy named Ali, barely 11, was summoned for special service. Stefan saw the fear in Ali's eyes, the way his hands trembled as he was led away. When Ali returned, his face was blank, his movements mechanical. Stefan wanted to comfort him, but the dormitory silence forbade it. Later in the darkness, Stefan heard Ali's muffled sobs, a sound that echoed Hassan's from months before. The next morning, Ali's bed was empty, his blanket folded neatly. Stefan's heart sank, the weight of another loss pressing on his chest. He whispered Ali's name in his nightly ritual, adding it to the litany of those the palace had claimed. Nikolai's defiance, however, grew bolder. One night he showed Stefan a stolen key, pilfered from a distracted eunuch. "It opens a storeroom near the second courtyard," he whispered, his eyes alight. "It's a start." Stefan's pulse quickened. The storeroom could be a hiding place, a step toward escape. But the risk was immense. Discovery meant the dungeons, or worse. Stefan hesitated, torn between hope and fear. Nikolai's courage was a fire, but Stefan knew fire could burn as well as warm. Still, they began to plan, mapping the palace's weaknesses in whispered fragments, their bond a fragile shield against the empire's weight. The palace's festivals, grand displays of Ottoman splendor, were a stark contrast to its hidden cruelties. Stefan was chosen to serve at a banquet, his grace and beauty earning him a place among the ichoglan, the palace pages. Clad in silk, he carried silver trays of sweets through halls filled with laughter and music. The Sultan, a distant figure behind a latticed screen, watched from above, his presence a shadow over the revelry. Stefan's hands trembled as he served a vizier, the same man who had summoned him before. The vizier's smile was a blade, cutting through Stefan's mask of composure. He floated above himself, his mind retreating to the oak tree in his village, its bark rough under his fingers as he carved his name. After the banquet, Mehmet pulled Stefan aside, his face grave. "You're noticed," he said, his voice low. "That's dangerous. The Sultan's eye is a curse as much as a blessing." Stefan's heart pounded. Being noticed meant favor, but also scrutiny, and the infirmary's shadow loomed closer. Mehmet's warning was a lifeline, but it came with a price. "Help me," Mehmet said, his voice breaking. "I need someone to take a boy to the vizier tomorrow. I can't do it again." Stefan froze, the weight of the request crushing him. To comply was to become complicit, to betray the boy he was. To refuse was to risk everything. He nodded, his throat tight, but in his heart, he vowed to find another way. The next day, Stefan and Nikolai stole a moment in the storeroom, the key trembling in Nikolai's hand. They hid behind crates of silk, their whispers urgent. "We can't wait forever," Nikolai said. "There's a caravan leaving for Vienna next month. We could hide in it." Stefan's mind raced, torn between the dream of freedom and the reality of the palace's reach. He thought of his mother, her cross necklace glinting in the dust, and of Maria, her laughter a fading echo. "I'm with you," he said finally, his voice steady despite the fear. They sealed their pact with a clasped hand, their fingers brushing the hidden cross and fabric, symbols of a past they refused to let die. As Stefan's 14th birthday approached, unmarked by celebration, he felt the palace's grip tightening. The eunuch's inspections grew more invasive, their hands probing for signs of manhood. Stefan saw boys like Yusuf, their spirits broken by the infirmary, and feared his time was coming. But he also saw the empire's crack guards who grew careless, passages left unguarded, whispers of rebellion among the Janissaries. The palace was a fortress, but no fortress was impregnable. Stefan and Nikolai began to hoard scraps of food, to sketch crude maps in the dirt, erased with a sweep of their feet. Each act was a step toward freedom, but also a step toward danger. One night as Stefan lay in the dormitory, he heard footsteps, not the usual patrol, but a softer tread. A eunuch stood over Nikolai's bed, his lantern casting a sickly glow. Nikolai was summoned, his face pale but defiant. Stefan's heart sank, knowing what special service meant. When Nikolai returned, his eyes were distant, his hands clenched. "We leave soon," he whispered, his voice hard, "or we die here." Stefan nodded, the weight of their plans settling on his shoulders. The palace had taught him to forget, but he chose to remember his name, his faith, his home. In Topkapı's gilded labyrinth, where cruelty wore a mask of splendor, Stefan's fight to remain himself was a war waged in silence, but it was a war he would not lose. The edge of freedom. The marble halls of Topkapı Palace gleam with a cold, unyielding beauty, their intricate tiles reflecting the flicker of oil lamps like eyes watching every move. Stefan, forced to answer to the name Süleiman, navigated this gilded labyrinth with the caution of a boy who had learned to survive. At 14, he was no longer the trembling child torn from Koprivshtitsa, but the Enderun school's relentless machinery had not yet extinguished the spark of Stefan, son of Ivan. His green eyes, shadowed by months of fear and vigilance, still held a stubborn defiance, a whisper of the boy who had carved his name into an oak tree, who clung to his mother Anna's lullabies in the quiet of his heart. With Nikolai, his Serbian friend whose courage burned like a beacon, Stefan stood on the brink of a desperate choice, surrender to the empire's gilded cage, or risk everything for a freedom that seemed both impossibly close and terrifyingly out of reach. The dormitory, with its rows of narrow beds under the watchful gaze of senior pages, was a prison of silence and control. Stefan lay awake at night, his fingers tracing the tiny cross he had carved beneath his bed frame, a secret rebellion so small it felt like a shout against the palace's suffocating grip. The scrap of Cyrillic embroidered fabric hidden in his sleeve was his lifeline to a past the palace sought to erase. Nikolai's wooden cross, tucked in a crack in the dormitory wall, was its twin, a symbol of their shared resistance. But the palace was a relentless predator, its inspections and punishments a constant reminder of its power. The screams from the infirmary, where boys faced castration, haunted Stefan's dreams. In the empty beds, Ali's, Yusuf's, and others were silent gravestones. Each loss tightened the knot in his chest, but it also steeled his resolve. He would not become another name erased by the palace's ledger. Nikolai's stolen key, pilfered from a careless eunuch, was their most dangerous treasure. The storeroom it unlocked, hidden near the second courtyard, was a cramped space filled with crates of silk and spices, a sanctuary where they could whisper without fear of eavesdropping. In those stolen moments, Stefan and Nikolai refined their plan. A caravan to Vienna, set to depart in 2 weeks, was their chance. A fragile hope born from myths of boys who had escaped to distant lands. "We hide in the carts," Nikolai whispered one night, his eyes fierce in the dim light of a smuggled candle. "The guards are careless at dawn. We could make it." Stefan's heart raced, torn between the dream of his village and the reality of the palace's reach. The walls were high, the punishments swift, but the key in Nikolai's hand was a spark of possibility, a crack in the empire's armor. The palace's hierarchy was a pyramid of complicity, each level preying on the one below. Mehmet, the senior page who had once been Marco from a Greek village, was a living warning of what survival could cost. His eyes, once bright with defiance, now carried a hollow weight. Stefan saw it when Mehmet selected boys for special service, his hands trembling as he led them to the hammam. One night, after sending a boy named Omar to a vizier, Mehmet lingered in the dormitory, his face pale. "You think I chose this?" he hissed to Stefan, his voice raw with anguish. "I was you angry, scared, clinging to a name no one remembers. But the palace always wins." Stefan wanted to argue, to cling to his defiance, but Mehmet's words stung like a lash. The empire turned victims into perpetrators, and Stefan feared the day he might face the same choice. The special preparations were a recurring nightmare, a ritual of violation that left Stefan hollow. Several times a month he was summoned to the hammam, where attendants bathed him in rose-scented water and dressed him in silk so thin it clung like a second skin. They taught him to move with grace, to keep his eyes downcast, to smile in a way that pleased. "You are the Sultan's gazelle," a eunuch once said, his voice soft but menacing. The chambers where Stefan was taken were opulent, with velvet cushions and gilded mirrors, but they were prisons of another kind. The viziers, with their silver beards and honeyed words, offered sweets or trinkets, but their touches were a theft of something Stefan couldn't name. He learned to float above his body, watching himself from a distance, a trick that dulled the pain but left a scar on his soul. Returning to the dormitory, he met the averted gazes of other boys, their silence a shared wound. One night, after a particularly cruel vizier, Stefan clutched the Cyrillic fabric, whispering his mother's lullaby until his voice broke. Nikolai in the next bed tapped their coat on the floor, a rhythm that said, "We're still here." Their resistance grew bolder, fueled by desperation. In the storeroom, they hoarded scraps of bread and dried figs, stolen from the kitchen during rare moments of distraction. Stefan sketched crude maps in the dirt, erased with a sweep of his foot, mapping the palace's weaknesses, unguarded passages, a gate that creaked at dawn. Nikolai's courage was afire, but Stefan tempered it with caution. "If we're caught," he whispered one night, "it's the dungeons or the cord." Nikolai's jaw tightened. "Better death than this," he said, his voice hard. Stefan nodded, but fear gnawed at him. He thought of his sister Maria, her laughter a fading echo, and of the oak tree where he'd carved his name. Freedom was a dream worth dying for, but he wasn't ready to die. The palace's festivals were a dazzling facade, masking its cruelty with splendor. Stefan, chosen for his grace, served at a banquet, carrying silver trays through halls filled with laughter and music. The Sultan, a shadowy figure behind a latticed screen, watched from above, his presence a weight on Stefan's chest. A vizier, the same one who had summoned him before, brushed his hand as Stefan offered a tray of sweets, his smile a blade. Stefan's mask of composure held, but inside he retreated to the memory of his village, the rough bark of the oak under his fingers. After the banquet, Mehmet pulled him aside. "The Sultan noticed you," he said, his voice low. "Be careful. His favor is a cage." Stefan's heart pounded. Being noticed meant danger, the infirmary, the cord, or worse. The threat of castration loomed closer. The eunuch's inspections grew more invasive, their hands probing for signs of manhood. Stefan, now taller, his voice beginning to deepen, saw the chief eunuch's gaze linger. One day he was summoned to the infirmary, his pulse racing as he passed the chamber where screams were born. The chief eunuch, his face like carved ivory, examined him, his hands cold and clinical. "Not yet," he said, dismissing Stefan with a wave. But the threat hung like a storm cloud. Stefan saw boys like Omar, their spirits broken by the procedure, their bodies forever altered. "They take your soul," Omar whispered one night, his voice a ghost. Stefan vowed to escape before the palace claimed his. Their plan took shape in the storeroom's shadows. The Vienna caravan, set to depart in 10 days, was their target. Nikolai had overheard a guard mention a loose board in a cart, a potential hiding place. They needed disguised as servants' robes, perhaps, stolen from the laundry. Stefan's heart raced at the thought, but doubt crept in. The palace's reach extended beyond its walls. Escapees were hunted, their families punished. He thought of his mother, her cross necklace glinting in the dust, and wondered if she still lived. Nikolai sensed his hesitation. "We're already dead here," he said, his eyes fierce. "This is our chance to live." Stefan nodded, his resolve hardening. They would run, or they would die trying. The palace's punishments grew harsher, a warning to those who dared dream of freedom. One boy, caught whispering in his native tongue, was dragged to the dungeons, his screams echoing through the marble halls. Stefan saw the fear in the other boy's eyes, a mirror of his own. The silk cord, the palace's ultimate sanction, was a specter that haunted them all. A senior page spoke of a boy who had tried to flee, only to be found strangled in a basement chamber, his death marked as natural causes. Stefan's stomach churned, but Nikolai's defiance bolstered him. "They want us to fear," Nikolai whispered, "but fear is a chain we can break." Their rebellion grew in small, dangerous acts. Stefan hid a stolen knife, its blade dull but sharp enough to cut rope, under a loose tile in the storeroom. Nikolai smuggled a map, torn from a book in the palace library, showing routes to the Habsburg border. They practiced their code taps on the floor, glances in the classroom until it was second nature. But the palace was watching. One night, a eunuch lingered near Nikolai's bed, his lantern casting a sickly glow. Stefan held his breath, fearing discovery, but the eunuch moved on. Nikolai's face was pale, but his resolve unshaken. "We're close," he whispered. "We can't stop now." Days before the caravan's departure, disaster struck. Nikolai was caught slipping food into his sleeve, a minor infraction that drew the chief eunuch's wrath. He was beaten with a bastinado, his cries muffled by a cloth. Stefan watched, helpless, as Nikolai limped back to the dormitory, his face pale but defiant. "I'm fine," Nikolai whispered, but his eyes told a different story. Stefan's heart sank, fear threatening to smother their plan. But Nikolai's resolve was unbroken. "We leave in 3 days," he said, his voice a vow. "With or without me, you run." The night before the caravan's departure, Stefan and Nikolai met in the storeroom, their breath visible in the cold air. They had stolen 2 servants' robes, their coarse fabric a stark contrast to the silk of special service. Nikolai's map, crumpled but legible, lay between them. "We hide in the cart at dawn," Nikolai said, his voice steady despite the pain in his swollen feet. "The guards change shifts then. It's our only chance." Stefan nodded, clutching the Cyrillic fabric. He thought of his mother, her cross necklace, and the oak tree in his village. "For them," he whispered. Nikolai clasped his hand, their fingers brushing the hidden cross and fabric, a pact sealed in defiance. As dawn approached, Stefan lay in the dormitory, his heart pounding. The palace slept, but its eyes never closed. He whispered his true name, Stefan, son of Ivan I last time, a prayer for courage. The Vienna caravan was their hope, their rebellion, their chance to break the curse of Topkapı. In the gilded labyrinth, where cruelty wore a mask of splendor, Stefan's fight to remain himself was a silent war, but it was a war he would wage until his last breath. The Final Gambit. The air in Topkapı Palace was thick with the weight of unspoken dread, each marble corridor a silent witness to the empire's unyielding cruelty. Stefan, still called Süleiman by the palace that sought to erase his past, moved through its gilded halls with the precision of a boy who had learned to survive. At 14, his green eyes, once bright with dreams of forging iron in Koprivshtitsa, now carried the weight of 2 years in the Andron school's crucible. Yet the spark of Stefan, son of Ivan, burned stubbornly within him, fueled by memories of his mother Anna's lullabies, his sister Maria's laughter, and the oak tree where he had carved his name. Beside him, Nikolai, his Serbian friend whose defiance was a fire against the palace's shadows, limped from the bastinado's cruelty, his swollen feet a testament to the risks they faced. The Vienna caravan, set to depart in 3 days, was their last hope, a fragile thread of freedom in a world of iron chains. The dormitory was a prison of silence, its narrow beds lined under the watchful gaze of senior pages. Stefan lay awake, his fingers brushing the tiny cross carved beneath his bed frame, a rebellion so small it was his only shield against the palace's suffocating control. The Cyrillic embroidered fabric, hidden in his sleeve, was his anchor, a tether to the village he feared he might never see again. Nikolai's wooden cross, tucked in a crack in the dormitory wall, was its twin, a symbol of their shared defiance. But the palace was a relentless predator, its punishments a constant reminder of its power. The empty beds, Omar's, Yusuf's, Ali's, were gravestones in the night, and the screams from the infirmary, where boys faced castration, haunted Stefan's dreams. Each loss was a wound, but it sharpened his resolve. He and Nikolai had vowed to escape, and the time to act was now. Their plan, forged in the storeroom shadows, was a desperate gamble. The stolen key, pilfered by Nikolai from a careless eunuch, had unlocked a cramped space where they hoarded scraps of bread, dried figs, and two servants' robes' coarse garments that contrasted sharply with the silk of special service. Nikolai's map, torn from a palace library book, showed routes to the Habsburg border, a crumpled promise of freedom. They had memorized the guards' patterns, the creak of a gate at dawn, the loose board in a caravan cart. "We hide at first light," Nikolai had whispered after his beating, his voice steady despite the pain in his feet. "The guards change shifts then. It's our only chance." Stefan had nodded, clutching the Cyrillic fabric, his mind racing with images of his mother's cross necklace glinting in the dust. Their pact was sealed, but the palace's eyes were everywhere. The hierarchy of Topkapı was a pyramid of complicity, each level preying on the one below. Mehmet, the senior page who had once been Marco, was a living warning of what survival could cost. His eyes, once bright with defiance, now carried a hollow weight. Stefan saw it when Mehmet selected boys for special service, his hands trembling as he led them to the hammam. One night after sending a boy named Khalid to a vizier, Mehmet cornered Stefan in the dormitory, his face pale. "You're planning something," he whispered, his voice low and urgent. "I see it in your eyes. Don't. The palace always finds out." Stefan's heart froze, but he forced a blank expression. "I'm just surviving," he lied, his voice steady. Mehmet's gaze lingered, torn between suspicion and pity. "Survival is a trap," he said, turning away. Stefan knew Mehmet's warning was a lifeline, but it came with a price. Trust was a luxury they couldn't afford. The special preparations were a recurring nightmare, a ritual of violation that left Stefan hollow. Summoned to the hammam, he was bathed in rose-scented water, dressed in silk that clung like a second skin, and taught to move with a grace that masked his terror. The viziers, with their silver beards and honeyed words, offered sweets or trinkets, but their touches were a theft of something Stefan couldn't name. He floated above his body, a trick to survive, but each encounter left a scar on his soul. One night after a vizier's visit, Stefan returned to the dormitory, his hands trembling. Nikolai, still limping, tapped their coat on the floor, a rhythm that said, "We're still here." Stefan clutched the Cyrillic fabric, whispering his mother's lullaby until his voice steadied. The palace could take his body, but it would not take his hope. Their rebellion grew bolder, fueled by desperation. In the storeroom, they added to their hoard a stolen knife, its blade dull but sharp enough to cut rope, hidden under a loose tile. Nikolai smuggled a second map, this one showing a river near the Habsburg border, a potential crossing point. They practiced their code taps on the floor, glances in the classroom until it was second nature. But the palace was watching. One afternoon during a calligraphy lesson, a eunuch lingered near Stefan, his eyes narrowing. "Your script is too bold," he said, his voice soft but menacing. "The Sultan prefers humility." Stefan bowed, his heart pounding, but the warning was clear. Their plan was a spark in a tinderbox, and one misstep could set it ablaze. The threat of castration loomed closer. The eunuch's inspections grew more invasive, their hands probing for signs of manhood. Stefan, now taller, his voice deepening, saw the chief eunuch's gaze linger. One day he was summoned to the infirmary, his pulse racing as he passed the chamber where screams were born. The chief eunuch, his face like carved ivory, examined him, his hands cold and clinical. "Soon," he said, his eyes glinting with a promise that chilled Stefan's blood. He returned to the dormitory, his legs shaking, and found Nikolai waiting. "We can't wait," Nikolai whispered, his voice fierce despite his pain. "The caravan leaves in 3 days. We go, or we lose everything." Stefan nodded, the memory of Omar's hollow eyes spurring him on. He would escape before the palace claimed his soul. The palace's festivals were a dazzling facade, masking its cruelty with splendor. Stefan, chosen for his grace, served at another banquet, carrying silver trays through halls filled with laughter and music. The Sultan, a shadowy figure behind a latticed screen, watched from above, his presence a weight on Stefan's chest. A vizier, the one who had summoned him before, brushed his hand as Stefan offered a tray of sweets, his smile ablaze. Stefan's mask of composure held, but inside he retreated to the memory of his village, the rough bark of the oak under his fingers. After the banquet, Mehmet pulled him aside. "The Sultan's eye is on you," he said, his voice low. "You're marked for the privy chamber. That's a death sentence in silk." Stefan's heart pounded. The privy chamber meant favor, but also the infirmary's knife. Their escape was now a race against time. 2 days before the caravan's departure, disaster struck. Nikolai, still limping from the bastinado, was caught hiding a stolen apple, a minor infraction that drew the chief eunuch's wrath. He was dragged to the courtyard, his hands bound and beaten again, the rod striking his already swollen feet. Stefan watched from a distance, helpless, his fists clenched as Nikolai's muffled cries echoed through the marble halls. When Nikolai returned to the dormitory, his face was pale, but his eyes burned with defiance. "I'm still going," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "They can break my body, but not my will." Stefan's heart twisted with guilt and admiration. Nikolai's courage was their anchor, but his injuries were a chain. That night in the storeroom, they finalized their plan. The caravan's third cart, with its loose board, was their hiding place. They would slip out at dawn during the guard change, disguised in the servants' robes. Nikolai's map, now creased and worn, lay between them. "We crossed the river here," Nikolai said, pointing to a smudged line. "The Habsburgs are beyond it. Freedom." Stefan nodded, clutching the Cyrillic fabric. He thought of his mother's cross necklace, glinting in the dust, and of Maria's laughter, a fading echo. "For them," he whispered. Nikolai clasped his hand, their fingers brushing the hidden cross and fabric, a pact sealed in defiance. The day before the caravan's departure, the palace tightened its grip. A boy, caught whispering in his native tongue, was dragged to the dungeons, his screams a warning to all. Stefan saw the fear in the other boy's eyes, a mirror of his own. The silk cord, the palace's ultimate sanction, was a specter that haunted them. A senior page spoke of a boy who had tried to flee, only to be found strangled in a basement chamber, his death marked as natural causes. Stefan's stomach churned, but Nikolai's resolve bolstered him. "They want us to fear," Nikolai whispered, his voice steady despite his pain. "But fear is a chain we can break." As dawn approached, Stefan and Nikolai prepared in the storeroom, their breath visible in the cold air. They pulled on the servants' robes, their coarse fabric a stark contrast to the silk of special service. Nikolai's map was tucked into his sleeve, the stolen knife in Stefan's. They moved through the second courtyard, past sleeping guards and flickering lamps, their hearts pounding. The caravan stood near the Gate of Felicity, its carts laden with silks and spices. The loose board in the third cart was their salvation, but the guards were closer than expected, their lanterns casting long shadows. Stefan's pulse raced as he and Nikolai crouched behind a barrel, waiting for the shift change. The palace slept, but its eyes never closed. With a final glance at Nikolai, whose swollen feet trembled, but whose eyes burned with resolve, Stefan whispered, "For freedom." Nikolai nodded, his hand clasping Stefan's. They darted forward, the loose board creaking as they slipped into the cart's dark confines. The air was thick with the scent of wool and dust, But it was their first breath of hope. The palace had taught them to forget, but Stefan chose to remember his name, his faith, his home. In Topkapı's gilded labyrinth, where cruelty wore a mask of splendor, their fight to remain themselves was a silent war, and the dawn would decide their fate. The price of freedom. The pre-dawn air in Topkapı Palace was heavy with the scent of dew and the faint tang of lamp oil, a stillness that masked the ever-watchful pulse of the empire's heart. Stefan, still called Süleiman by the palace that sought to erase him, lay in the dormitory, his heart pounding like a war drum. At 14, he was a shadow of the boy who had carved his name into an oak tree in Koprivshtitsa, yet the spark of Stefan, son of Ivan, burned fiercely within him. His green eyes, hardened by 2 years in the Enderun school's crucible, held a quiet defiance, fueled by the memory of his mother Anna's lullabies and his sister Maria's laughter. Beside him, Nikolai, his Serbian friend whose courage had become their beacon, lay still, his swollen feet a painful reminder of the bastinado's cruelty. The Vienna caravan, set to depart at dawn, was their final chance, a fragile thread of hope in a world of iron chains. The dormitory was a tomb of silence, its narrow beds lined like soldiers under the watchful gaze of senior pages. Stefan's fingers brushed the tiny cross carved beneath his bed frame, a rebellion so small it was his only shield against the palace's suffocating control. The Cyrillic embroidered fabric hidden in his sleeve was his anchor, a tether to the village he feared he might never see again. Nikolai's wooden cross, tucked in a crack in the wall, was its twin, a symbol of their shared defiance. But the palace was a relentless predator, its punishments a constant reminder of its power. The empty beds, Omar's, Yusuf's, Ali's, were gravestones in the night, and the screams from the infirmary, where boys faced castration, haunted Stefan's dreams. Each loss was a wound, but it also sharpened his resolve. Today he and Nikolai would run, or they would die trying. Their plan, forged in the storeroom shadows, was a desperate gamble. The stolen key had unlocked a cramped space where they hoarded scraps of bread, dried figs, and 2 servants' robes, coarse, patched garments that contrasted sharply with the silk of special service. Nikolai's map, torn from a palace library book, showed routes to the Habsburg border, a crumpled promise of freedom. They had memorized the guards' patterns, the creak of a gate at dawn, the loose board in a caravan cart. "We hide at first light," Nikolai had whispered the night before, his voice steady despite the pain in his feet. The guards changed shifts then. It's now or never. Stefan had nodded, clutching the Cyrillic fabric, his mind racing with images of his mother's cross necklace glinting in the dust. For them, he had vowed, sealing their pact with a clasped hand. As the dormitory stirred with the first murmurs of dawn prayers, Stefan slipped from his bed, his movements silent as a shadow. Nikolai followed, his limp barely concealed, his eyes fierce with determination. They crept through the 3rd courtyard, past sleeping guards and flickering lamps, to the storeroom. The key turned with a soft click, and they slipped inside, pulling on the servants' robes. The coarse fabric scratched Stefan's skin, but it felt like armor, a disguise that might carry them beyond the palace's reach. Nikolai tucked the map into his sleeve, his fingers brushing the wooden cross. "Ready?" he whispered. Stefan nodded, his heart a storm of fear and hope. They stepped into the pre-dawn chill, the palace looming like a gilded beast behind them. The 2nd courtyard was a maze of shadows, its marble paths slick with dew. The caravan, a line of creaking carts laden with silks and spices, stood near the gate of felicity, guarded by janissaries whose yawns betrayed the hour's lethargy. Stefan and Nikolai crouched behind a stack of barrels, their breaths shallow. The loose board in the third cart, overheard by Nikolai from a careless guard, was their target. They waited, hearts pounding, as a guard wandered past, his lantern casting long shadows. When his footsteps faded, they darted forward, Stefan's stolen knife trembling in his hand. The board lifted with a groan, revealing a narrow space beneath bolts of cloth. Nikolai slid in first, his swollen feet making him wince, and Stefan followed, pulling the board shut. The darkness was suffocating, the air thick with the scent of wool and dust, but it was their first taste of freedom. The cart lurched as the caravan began to move, the rumble of wheels masking Stefan's racing pulse. He clutched the Cyrillic fabric, whispering his true name, Stefan, son of Ivan, like a prayer. Nikolai's hand found his in the dark, a silent vow. But freedom was fragile. The caravan paused at the palace gates, and voices, sharp, authoritative, cut through the morning air. Stefan's stomach churned as boots thumped closer, a guard inspecting the carts. A lantern's light seeped through the board's cracks, and Stefan held his breath, fearing the slightest sound would betray them. Nikolai's grip tightened, his eyes fierce even in the dimness. The guard moved on and the cart rolled forward, passing through the gates into the city beyond. Istanbul's streets were a blur of noise and color, the calls of merchants and the clatter of hooves a stark contrast to the palace's oppressive silence. Stefan and Nikolai remained still, their bodies cramped in the cart's confines, the stolen food their only sustenance. Hours passed, the city's din giving way to the quiet of open roads. Stefan's mind wandered to Koprivshtitsa, the oak tree, his mother's cross necklace, his sister's laughter. Would they still be there, waiting? Or had the palace's shadow reached them too? Nikolai, sensing his doubt, whispered, "We're free, Stefan. Hold on to that." The use of his true name, a forbidden act, was a spark that warmed Stefan's heart. But the palace's reach was long. At a checkpoint, the caravan halted and voices grew sharp. Stefan's pulse spiked as boots circled the cart, a guard's hand tapping the boards. "Check, everyone," a voice commanded. Stefan's knife, hidden in his sleeve, felt useless against the Empire's might. Nikolai's eyes met his, a silent question. Fight or hide? Before they could decide, the board was pried open, and light flooded the space. A janissary's face loomed, his scimitar gleaming. "Out!" he barked. Stefan's heart sank, but Nikolai moved first, lunging with a ferocity that belied his injuries. He tackled the guard, giving Stefan a split second to scramble out. They ran, the caravan's chaos their only cover. Shouts rang out, and hooves thundered as more guards gave chase. Stefan's legs burned, his breath ragged, but Nikolai's limp slowed him. "Go!" Nikolai hissed, shoving Stefan forward. "I'll hold them." Stefan hesitated, torn between loyalty and survival, but Nikolai's fierce glare pushed him on. He darted into a forest, branches tearing at his robe, the Cyrillic fabric clutched in his hand. Behind him, Nikolai's shout was cut short, and Stefan's heart twisted with guilt. He ran until his lungs screamed, collapsing in a clearing as dusk fell, the palace's shadow still looming in his mind. Alone, Stefan pressed on, guided by Nikolai's map and the stars above. The Habsburg border was days away, a journey fraught with danger, bandits, hunger, and the Empire's hunters. He scavenged berries, drank from streams, and slept in hollows, the knife his only defense. Each night he whispered his mother's lullaby, the Cyrillic fabric his only comfort. Nikolai's fate gnawed at him. Had he been caught, killed, or worse? The guilt was a weight, but Stefan honored it by moving forward, each step a defiance of the palace that had tried to break him. Days later, exhausted and gaunt, Stefan reached a river marking the Habsburg border. A merchant, seeing his tattered state, offered bread and a cloak, mistaking him for a refugee. Stefan, wary but desperate, accepted, his voice hoarse as he spoke his true name for the first time in years. "Stefan, son of Ivan," he said, the words a declaration. The merchant, a kind-eyed man, nodded, offering passage to a nearby town. Stefan boarded a cart, the Cyrillic fabric pressed to his chest, and as the river faded behind him, he felt the palace's grip loosen, if only slightly. Freedom was not the end of Stefan's war. The Empire's shadow lingered in his nightmares, screams from the infirmary, Nikolai's fierce eyes, the silk cord's silent threat. He vowed to find Koprivshtitsa, to see if his mother and sister still lived, to tell the world of Topkapı's horrors. The palace had taken his childhood, his friends, and nearly his soul, but it had not taken his name. In a Habsburg tavern, Stefan scratched his story into a scrap of parchment, his words a rebellion against the silence the palace had demanded. He wrote of Nikolai, of the boys who vanished, of the oak tree that held his name. The Empire's glory was built on their bones, but Stefan's survival was a crack in its foundation. Years later, as a man, Stefan would learn of Nikolai's fate captured, returned to the palace, and broken by the dungeons. The news was a knife, but it sharpened Stefan's resolve. He carried his story to Vienna, to priests and scribes, who recorded the Devshirme's horrors. His words, like the cross he had carved, were a testament to those who had not escaped. The palace had taught him to forget, but Stefan chose to remember, for his mother, for Nikolai, for the boys whose names were erased. In the shadow of Topkapı's gilded walls, where cruelty wore a mask of splendor, Stefan's fight to remain himself had won him freedom, but the cost was a wound that would never fully heal. Thank you so much for watching Stefan's emotional journey through the shadows of Topkapı Palace. We hope this story has shed new light on history and the resilience of the human spirit. If you found it meaningful, please give it a like, share it with your friends, and hit that subscribe button to stay updated with more captivating videos. Your support keeps us going and inspires us to share more powerful stories. See you in the next one.